You want to take on responsibility. You want to take on the heaviest load that you can conceive of, that you might be able to move, because it gives your life nobility and purpose. And that offsets the tragedy. And not only psychologically, not only does it offset it psychologically because you have a purpose and something to wake up for, right, and to face the difficulties of the day, but also because if you face the difficulties of the day properly, you actually ameliorate suffering, not only in the psychological sense, but because you make the world at least a less terrible place. And that's something, right? To move things away from hell is something, even if you're not, self-evidently moving forthrightly to heaven. To move things away from the worst they can be is, well, that's a noble goal in and of itself. So, and young people are starving for that idea. It's very interesting to watch.
As I look at it, it seems to me that Acton had it right. Freedom properly understood needs to be seen as a negative and as a positive. The negative is a sort of concept of freedom from fear, addiction, persecution, tyranny in a personal sense, and then freedom to be is to reach your potential. But it seems to me that what's missing is an understanding that freedom exercised within a framework of responsibility, i.e. doing what you ought, will guarantee ongoing freedom for yourself and for your neighbours. Freedom exercised in a way that confuses it with licence tends to destroy freedom. In fact, you could even go so far as to say that misunderstood, freedom turns out to be its own worst enemy.
Well, that's the difficult distinction between freedom of the moment and freedom of the freedom with everything taken into account. I mean, I'm a real admirer of the work of Jean Piaget, and Piaget is a developmental psychologist, and few people know, the world's most well-known developmental psychologist, and few people know that he was actually motivated in his intellectual pursuits by the desire to reconcile science with religion. That was what his driving force from the time that he was a young man. You wouldn't know that even necessarily by reading his writings, because it's implicit rather than explicit in them. But he has a different model of what constitutes morality than Freud. Freud's model is combative. It's sort of the superego as tyrant. So the superego would be the strictures of society, the id, the biological impulses, and the ego crushed between those, right? So the ego is this thing that's crushed between nature and culture. And so it's a tense and combative model of the human psyche. And there's something about it that's accurate, because some of the restrictions that are put on your impulse gratification are imposed on you in a sense tyrannically. But Piaget's perspective was much more optimistic, and I think much more accurate. He noticed that as children organized themselves spontaneously as they developed, especially within the confines of their own spontaneous play, they didn't so much subsume or inhibit their dark and aggressive impulses as make them sophisticated and transform them into universally acceptable games. So for Piaget, a game that a group of children were playing, that all of them were playing voluntarily and that was going well and that they all wanted to continue playing, was a microcosm of society, and literally a microcosm of society. The reason the children were playing those games was to practice being productive members of society. And he felt that the appropriate game tended towards what he described as an equilibrated state. So an equilibrated state would be a game that you'll play because you've decided it's a good game, but that you can play with others because they've also decided that it's a good game. And so that can work at the individual level and at the familial level and at the social level. And if you get all those things working simultaneously, then you have a sustainable enterprise. And it's predicated not so much on the inhibition of impulse or on the regulation of it, but of the integration of impulses into a pattern of being that gratifies them on a relatively permanent basis. So, if you want to go to university and become a physician, I think there's a lot of sacrifice of impulsive gratification that goes along with that. But if you become a physician, then it's a noble enterprise, people support you socially, and all of the needs that you need to have fulfilled will also be fulfilled by that enterprise. Well, that's a way better model. And so it's strange that the maximum freedom comes with the adoption of a discipline and then also the adoption of responsibility. That frees you up and everyone else around you in the long run. And if you explain that to people, especially in this day and age when they've been fed a never-ending diet of idiot rights and freedoms, they're immediately on board with it because they know. They know that most of the meaning that people experience in their life is a consequence of adopting responsibility. So they're starving for that idea to be articulated.
Opens up a whole can of very, very interesting issues. Let's try and pick a couple of them. But before I do, it's evident to me, and I'm enormously encouraged by this because you know, I'm a passionate Australian. I want this country to be the sort of place that offers opportunities of the sort that I had when I was young. You know, I've had my opportunities, but I look at my kids' generation. What's going to be there for them if we keep feeding them this sort of thin gruel? In reality, the people turning out in vast numbers, every one of your talks in Australia has been oversubscribed massively. It tells you they kind of get that there's more to this than they're being told.
Oh yeah, they know. Well, it's one of the things that's so interesting about dealing with archetypal themes. You know, archetypal themes are archetypal because they actually speak of the structure of human experience. That's why they last. And so it's human nature and human experience has a pattern. You don't have the capacity to articulate that pattern as an individual, in part because your life is too short. You just can't figure it out. But the ancient representations of those patterns are everywhere around you. And you know some of them in image, you cotton onto them automatically. You fall into them if you go to a movie, for example, because movies always express archetypal themes. If you hear them articulated, you think, I knew that. I knew that. I just didn't know how to say it. That's the Platonic idea of learning as remembering. Your soul already knows, but it doesn't have the words. And so when people talk to me about watching my lectures, let's say, they basically say one of two things. If it's not just a simple thank you, they say one of two things. A third of them say, a quarter of them say, when I listen to you talk, it's as if you're telling me things that I already know. It's like, yeah, well, that's exactly right, because that's what archetypal stories are. They're the description of what you already know. But that can be articulated, and then who you are and how you see yourself and the way you describe yourself all become the same thing. So that's wonderful. Then you're not at odds with yourself, you know? And then you have, then you're a functioning unity, and that makes you much stronger and more indomitable than you would otherwise be. And then the other thing that people say, and this is more like 3/4 of them, is that they say, I was in a very dark place, I was addicted, I was drinking too much, I had a fragmented relationship with my fiancée, and I wasn't getting married, things weren't going very well with my family, my relationship with my father was damaged, I didn't have any aim, I was wasting my time, some variant of that, some combination of those. And they said, well, I've been watching your lectures, I've decided to establish a purpose, I'm trying to tell the truth, and things are way better. And so let's say I've done maybe 8 or 9 large-scale public talks in the last 2 months, so that's probably 20,000 people, and about half of them, a third to half of them, have stayed afterwards to talk to me. So that's about 7,000 people who have said that to me. And then people stop me on the street all the time and tell me exactly that story, which is just wonderful. Like, you can't imagine how good it is to be able to go to places you've never been and to have people stop you on the street spontaneously and say, look, my life is way better than it was. It's like, it's so good. And I've got like, I don't know, 35,000 letters from people since last August. It's more than that. I can't keep track of them. And it's exactly the same thing. Like a quarter of them say, well, you've given me the words to say what I already knew was true. And thank you for that. I can see that in the audience. It's so interesting because I can lay out a story. People go like this. And they're doing that all the time. It's like the lights are going on. And that's a really, well, there's almost nothing better than that, to watch lights go on when you're talking to people. It's like, that's just absolutely fantastic. But to get this response from people, my father's about 80, he's 83, I think, 81. He's 81. And I put him in charge of going through my viewer email, which is an overwhelming job, but no, we've had discussions about this constantly. He's overwhelmed by the fact that so many people are writing and saying the same thing. It's like, well, I have a purpose, man. My life actually matters. I finally realized that, and I'm putting it into practice, and I'm bearing up under the heaviest load I can imagine, and it's really helping. It's like, God. And that's tens of thousands of responses now. So you couldn't hope for anything better than that. There's zero harm in it, right? It's just people putting their lives together. They're not mucking about with other people. They're not trying to make broad-scale social transformations about which they have no idea. They're trying to make their immediate environment better. And it's working. It's like, great. It's great.
You say there's zero harm in it. I'd say as a former legislator that there's an enormous amount of good in it. A country is only the sum total of the people that make it up. To the extent that they're put together, resilient, able to contribute, don't have to ask others to help them, the stronger the nation and the society will be.
And rapidly. Like I think, I was thinking the other day, a journalist asked me why the audience, why people are responding so positively to what I'm saying, the young men, for example, and I thought, why? Yeah, that's a good question. He says, well, I'm actually on their side. I'm really happy that they're not wasting their lives. I'm really sad to see that people are disenchanted and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and aimless and perverse and vengeful and all of those things. It's terrible. And then to see people question whether that's necessary and then to start to rise out of it. It's like, it's so fun. Like last night I was after my talk, it's overwhelming. I don't usually think about these things, but I was after my talk last night, and so all these people line up, and they have their 15 seconds with me, and they're kind of tentative. They're excited and attentive when they come up to talk to me, and then they have 15 seconds of time to tell me something. I'm really listening to them, and they're hesitant about whether or not to share the good news about their life, and I think it's often because when people share good news about their life, people don't necessarily respond positively. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. And so they'll tell me something good, and I think, oh, that's so good. Somebody says, oh, I'm getting along way better with my father. I hadn't seen him for 10 years, and now we get along. It's like, God, great. Yeah. And then the power of that, you can't overstate the power of that for individuals to get their life together. The individual is an unbelievably powerful force, and every single person who gets their act together a little bit has the capacity to spread that around them. It's a chain reaction, and so it's a lovely thing to see.